this panel also, what does it mean to be a woman of color during this time?
I guess I'll start that one.
Sips tea.
So let me say this. So the publication I work for focuses on reproductive health rights and justice, which means we do a lot of reporting about topics that are highly politicized and polarizing, and also we do a lot of specialized health reporting. And so, you can't talk about our work without talking about abortion. And so what that means is that we've always been under fire in terms of the content we offer. For me specifically, being a woman of color who is also a journalist, it means that I have been the only one in many spaces. We just talked about being at the same journalism school, and I shared how I was the only African American student in my graduate school cohort, and that certainly hasn't changed. That's been the same no matter where I've gone. In terms of my education, whether it was my history PhD program or my journalism master's program. And I will say that I am known in conservative and anti-abortion circles as Black Abortion Girl. And so I routinely get all sorts of hate mail to my personal Twitter account. We certainly receive hate mail relatively frequently at our job site. And those things are connected. Like, certainly I am a more obvious target in many ways, because also my scholarly research is partially about reproductive health. So I have a forthcoming book about African Americans and abortion. So you can just imagine what that looks like. And, newsrooms, and I don't work in a traditional newsroom. I work at home in my office. I'm connected to all my coworkers through an online network that we have. But I think that newsrooms have been slow to actually acknowledge the very real security issues that we as journalists face. So, and I don't think, I'm saying anything that my supervisors would hate by saying we have been slow to do that, to think about when we send reporters out to Capitol Hill. We also have the only known trans Capitol Hill reporter in the country working for us. And so when we send reporters to Capitol Hill, like, what happens when they meet people face to face who are anti-abortion people, who want to get them on camera, who want to bum rush them and get them to say something in a moment of stress and conflict. And so that's something that we've dealt with every day before, the current political climate in which journalists are definitely under fire in different ways. We also, as a nonprofit and smaller media organization, find that it's sometimes hard for us to get credentials to go places because we do social justice journalism. And so what that means is that we do sometimes have a point of view. That doesn't mean we're not objective, but it means we have a stance. And one of those things is that we believe that everyone has the right to have comprehensive health care, whether that is contraception, whether that's abortion, whether that's free STI testing, any of those things. And so, we are existing at Rewire.News in an atmosphere which we've always existed in since we were founded about a decade ago. And I, as a woman of color, we also have a Black woman managing editor. So half of our senior level editorial staff is Black women, which is unusual. And that sets us apart in a lot of different ways, for better or for worse.
Having left the newsroom about 4 years ago now, and that was my second time leaving the newsroom, I look at the current landscape and the current conditions in which journalists find themselves working as being conditions in which being a woman of color and being a journalist of color, that experience now becomes legible for everyone. That the experience of being harassed because of who you are and what you do has now become something that more people are familiar with, because journalism as a whole has been thrown into a debate, into a frenzy around sensational terms. And so as I watch journalists talk about what they encounter every single day, the hate mail, the calls that they get, the fear for their safety when they go out into the field, I'm sympathetic, because I do remember when I was working in newsrooms that the conditions were exactly the same. But now individuals who otherwise could have passed, could have just gone in being a white male, gone in being a white woman, gone in being whomever they were, and not experience the same kind of prejudicial treatment, are being exposed to that. and they see what it's like. They see what it's like for some of their other colleagues from different spaces. I think that at this time, in the same way that we have dealt with difficulty establishing credibility in communities of color, we're seeing that that difficulty is extending to larger communities, and now it's becoming a problem for more people. So I see it as making those same experiences very legible and very real for people who otherwise enjoyed privileges that did not introduce them to those sort of dangers.
Which
I'm sorry, Dr. Ferrier has been kind enough to join us this afternoon, but has to catch a flight.
I will. I'm going to finish this last thought if I can. Thank you. That's okay. And then I will dash out. So my apologies. It has been a tough day, and thank you for the reminder. Just recently, 3 weeks ago, I released a brand new report that I wrote in conjunction with the International Women's Media Foundation. It was an international study of journalists across the world in the online as well as physical violence that we've experienced. When Trollbusters was started 4 years ago, most of the work I did was overseas in repressive regimes, whether it was in Russia or the Ukraine or other European Union countries. Sadly, much of my work now is here in the U.S. as we have seen that ratcheting up of the rhetoric in our national scene that has crossed this divisiveness across the way. As we look at this kind of situation and you talk about the intersectionality of our work, everybody has gotten trolled. Everyone has experienced it, whether it's the public, whether it's journalists or not. And so Meredith's comments, Dr. Clark's comments about that others are now recognizing the kinds of space that journalists of color have lived in for years, they're now coming to experience that. However, from my perspective, in looking at online harassment and the violence that's perpetrated, what we see is there's a very different way in which male journalists, white male journalists, and others are treated online versus women, journalists of color, LGBTQIA journalists, and others who are operating online, those that have visible identities online that can be called out, are often targeted. And our own government at this time is in the process. They have an RFP out to collect the names, social handles, and information on every single journalist that works here in the U.S. If you're not afraid of what's happening in our country right now, you should be. Because if they come after the journalists and we are not able to tell our stories or to be free in telling our stories or are silenced behind the scenes for fear for our lives, then you all are not getting the information you need to make good decisions, whether it's at the polls or in your own life. And so my message today is that we cannot rely on our news organizations to provide and open a door for us. Broadcasting as an industry was much more open to it because there were accountability mechanisms put in place if they didn't diversify their staffs. Newspapers and newsroom and the print side of our business has been very slow without that kind of club to even participate in the surveys to get some transparency into what's happening in the newsrooms. I know what it was like to work in the newsroom, and I don't think anyone should have to be afraid of not being at work for fear of what's going to get in the newspaper, and then being at work and being under attack both inside the newsroom and outside the newsroom by your audiences. And it's critical that we understand that the dynamics of today's digital environment, we are all under attack, and that our media organizations and our schools of higher education need to train our students to be able to operate in these very difficult spaces. So thank you very much for having me here today. Very much appreciate being here and would welcome any follow-up with me on my social channels or otherwise. But I'm leaving you in very, very capable hands. So thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We're going to take a pause for just a second to adjust our panel, and then we're going to jump back into the conversation. And I believe, will there also be some opportunity for audience questions?
As a matter of fact, yes.
And I'm going to grab this microphone
Okay.
so that we can do that.
Pardon? Okay. We can, with the go ahead and answer the question and then follow up after that, revisit. I think we're on break right now, so I don't think they're, are you streaming at present?
We are not.
Okay,
No.
good.
If you need to take a second, but
Mm.
we can begin the conversation back again whenever you all are ready.
Okay, I had a couple of questions, but I didn't know if they would. On the fly there, and I was really interested in that. But I said, now, which one of them said that? I couldn't remember. They are. So I will ask that question. You can follow up with your answer. Well, you can follow up first. Then I'll ask you that question. Then we can turn it over to them. Okay, Dr. Greenlee had a follow-up that she wanted to make to one of the previous questions. We're going to let her do that first.
Can I ask you to restate the question before?
Okay.
Is that okay?
Okay. Which question was it? The one about the woman of color question?
Just say we're going to revisit.
Okay. And then, Dr. Let me see, what's your last name? Clark. Clark. I was going to say Meredith, but.
It's fine.
Is going to answer one more question, and then I'm done and can completely turn it
So
over to.
then you just look at me and I will take the microphone out to whoever raises their hand.
Okay, sounds good.
Pass it around, okay?
Sounds good.
Like I said, we'll give you, I think we are ready to go. We're
Okay.
streaming, so go ahead and introduce yourself and your panel.
Okay.
We're ready to go.
We are back with you at this time. I am, again, Marjorie Fuller. I'm the Director of Diversity. I'm sorry. I'm the Director of the Center for Black Culture and Research here at WVU. And we have with us Dr. Greenlee and Dr. Clark, who are going to continue the discussion. Dr. Ferrier had to leave us as she had another obligation. Before we move to audience questions, we are going to revisit the last question that I asked, which was, what does it mean to be a journalist of color in a moment when journalists and the First Amendment are being publicly attacked literally and institutionally at every turn? And Dr. Greenlee had a follow-up that she would like to give to that question.
So my follow-up is partially general. I wanted to say something as like the working journalist on the panel, that being a woman of color journalist means, in various newsrooms I've worked in, it means that I pay a certain cultural tax, which means that whenever we had a community event, I'm not speaking in my current position, just because my editors are watching, but I would always be the one to do the community work. And it was because we wanted to have an idea in the community that our newsroom was more diverse than it actually was. So I often found myself in positions where I was out in a community talking about a reporter's work, which was actually not someone's work. I had edited because we wanted people not to know that our newsroom and all the other editors except me were white men. And so that's challenging, and it's also challenging in the room where you're making decisions about your daily or weekly or monthly content, because people's life experiences do absolutely matter. And thinking even beyond that, like being a reporter in the field, I recently had done some on-the-ground reporting for one of my reporters who was not in the area when my city, Durham, North Carolina, the Confederate statue was toppled by activists, young activists, and I stepped out of my car in front of the courthouse, and I was instantly followed by a man who made very clear his white supremacist tendencies. And I lived in a space where we could not avoid encountering people who, actively wished me harm in that moment. And so there are also considerations about being a woman journalist, being a journalist of color, which means that there are actual physical spaces that are difficult for me to be in. Now, I very rarely report. I do reporting for some of my own freelance work, but that's one of the realities of that job, and that reality has become even more heightened. So beyond the general, I'm a woman reporter and I'm going out to some place to meet someone to interview them, and I don't know who they are, there's the added stress of knowing that we live in a moment when journalists are being vilified and people don't trust the fourth estate the way we think they used to.
Disturbing to even hear that. We have one more question that I would like to ask Dr. Clark, and then we'll be turning the microphone over to our audience for questions. I heard the panel discussing this earlier during a meeting, and as I heard you talking about the fact that there's a lack of responsiveness by newsrooms as far as collecting and submitting diversity data and doing it effectively. So I'd like to know, what impact does that have on newsroom diversity?
Well, it makes the situation and the context in which we find our newsrooms, it makes it completely opaque. If we don't have newsrooms volunteering the data of their staffing, the racial representation that's there, the gender representation that's there, we are asking LGBTQIA identifying journalists to identify themselves out of some concerns of not having federal protections, so not having to out themselves at work, but instead being counted by participating themselves. If we don't have that information, it's impossible for us to know, one, how well the industry is doing with its challenge to diversify, and then also where some of the weak spots are, where are some of the places that we can make improvements, and where are some of the success stories? What newsrooms are doing this well, are doing it right, and what behaviors can they model for other newsrooms that are facing similar structural challenges? So we've certainly had our challenges in collecting the data. The data is collected through a survey that is administered via email. So there's hurdle number one, because everyone gets too much email and it's very easy to look over it. But then there's also been just outright obstinate refusal to submit the survey data in some cases. I received a number of emails that said, we're all white here, there's no need for us to participate, or this takes up too much time, indicating that being transparent about who is on staff and the communities that you serve is not a concern to the editors in a particular newsroom. So for us, it leaves us with the challenge of not having enough political will to be honest about who we are, who we represent, and the difficulties we face in being inclusive.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. We'll turn now to our audience for questions.
Ask you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Rochelle Ford. I'm the Dean of the School of Communications at Elon University. Thank you so much for hosting this event and participating on the panel. As you know, newsrooms are shrinking. They don't have the budgets that they used to. They're not making the investments into higher education that they used to, because they just, the financial structure of news, of media, is being dismantled day by day. And we're trying to come up with new ways of addressing that issue. So if you look at that additional layer of complexity, has it actually gotten worse in terms of the progress because of the layoffs and the inability to have people working full-time in various positions? Or has it simply changed? Or are certain parts of the news industry, like broadcast, which appear to be more diverse than they was when I was a child, are parts of the segment better despite the reduction in news teams?
So I can speak to digital and print newsrooms in particular. AS&E for a number of years, in addition to collecting the racial and ethnic makeup of the newsrooms, asked questions about whether your newsroom was going to grow or contract year over year, and that is data that the organization tracks as well. For a while now, we have seen a downward trend in the number of jobs that are being added to newsrooms. At one point in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a little bit of stabilization, but we're facing a number of indicators that tell us that newsrooms are continuing to contract, but they're also continuing to change. They are becoming not necessarily centralized newsrooms, centralized buildings. So as Dr. Greenlee talked about with her newsroom, it is actually a network of people around the country. So in some instances, yes, we see conditions are worsening as journalism staffs in traditional newsrooms are laid off, as digital startups don't find necessarily the kind of financial support they need to continue their operations. But then in other cases, we are seeing there are some opportunities for news outlets to grow. ProPublica, for instance, and the influx of donor support that they had after the election has allowed them to hire a number of new journalists and place them in places outside of New York. They've opened a bureau in Chicago. So there are still structural challenges in terms of the economic impact of the overall downturn with the Great Recession, and also the economic model shifting away from an advertiser base to a subscription base or a micropayments base that is keeping pace with our challenges with diversity. And I think, as you mentioned, it just makes the problem more complex than it has been in previous eras.
But I think there is some data, and you probably know more about this than I do. I've survived 3 layoffs at 3 different types of media organizations, and that's not necessarily totally uncommon. But it seems to me very anecdotally, and I think there are numbers to suggest that layoffs, Black journalists particularly, are more likely to be laid off than journalists of other races for whatever reason. And so I'd be curious to know if there's data out there about other racial ethnic groups and other groups of people who have been marginalized from being in traditional newsrooms. But certainly in my experience, I have scores and scores of friends who are African-American journalists who are laid off. And in one hand, I mean, what that means for me as an assigning editor is that the pool of freelancers, which is difficult, actually there are a lot of really qualified journalists who are now scrapping to do very basic stories for me, which is not something that I'm praising, right? So it's something that the pool is getting larger for people who really do deep investigative work but can't find that work and are doing, kind of one-off stories. So it means the pool of freelancers is bigger, but that's part of the gig economy. And so what does it mean? Do we as a media organization want to essentially exist off of freelancers? And that's a question that we all have to ask ourselves.
Introduce yourself.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? Okay. My name is Kintia Prince. I'm a graduate student in the Interactive Media program at Elon. And so my question is, what advice would you give to newsrooms that want to create newsrooms that look like the demographics that they serve?
My advice is to find the political will to do so. Ultimately, it comes down to the choices that newsrooms are willing to make. There are complaints about the pipeline being broken or the pipeline being slow. There are complaints about not finding people who have the talent or having to invest too much in those individuals only for them to go on to other publications. And at some point, all of this boils down to leadership having the political will to make the changes that they need to make to diversify their newsrooms, to invest in the individuals that they bring in and give them a sense of growth in that newsroom so that they can stay in that newsroom. And then it comes down to looking outside of the pipeline. I like to get away from that metaphor. I don't believe it was actually really accurate. And if we focus on the pipeline, it's pretty lazy. You want people to come directly to you. You're not going to go out and get them. I think about irrigating and getting more people interested in journalism earlier. So as an intervention, I suggest reaching out to middle schools, reaching out to high schools and showing them what journalism careers are like. And also reaching outside of journalism schools in and of themselves. And now as a journalism school graduate, I'm sure my deans are shuddering, but there's plenty of talent from other places, individuals with specialized knowledge that we need to be doing reporting in newsrooms. And what it takes to get them in there is the political will to do so.